My name is Chris Bortlik. I'm an architect at the Microsoft Technology Center in Boston. Been with Microsoft for about 11 years, and my entire time has been focused on SharePoint and related technologies, including things in Office 365 and our security solutions. After the session, probably tomorrow, I will post these slides as well as a bunch of screenshots. So we're going to do a lot of demos in the session, as well as articles. It's going to go through a lot of the configuration steps because I know sometimes it's tough to get access to the recordings and other things of the session. So I want to put that out there as quickly as I can tomorrow. So what we're going to cover in the next hour is really three topics. We're going to first talk about our layered approach to security and compliance in Office 365, a number of scenarios around SharePoint and OneDrive specifically. Most of the sessions are going to be live demonstration. I'm going to kind of go through four of the most common scenarios that I work with enterprise customers with at the Technology Center in Boston. And then I'm going to have some links to some of the resources as follow-up. So I've been at Microsoft for about 11 years. Before I joined Microsoft, I spent 14 years myself as an enterprise architect, mainly working in financial services. And during my 25 years in the industry, as many of you have probably noticed, it's a real balance between security and usability. If we over-secure, we over-protect, we lock things down too hard, we just drive our users, number one, frustrated, we drive them crazy, and we encourage them to try to work around our systems, our tools, and our processes. So I try to take a very practical and pragmatic approach to security compliance. Again, realizing that a lot of you work in regulated industries, and I worked in financial services, I work with a lot of healthcare customers, but I always try to put the user at the center and think about the balance of usability and productivity. Now, when I'm working with customers at the Technology Center, really there are a number of key considerations when we think about securing and protecting Office 365. Microsoft, as I'm sure you've heard, have talked a lot about identity being the control plane and starting off with who is the user. No longer can we always rely on just the network being the control plane for securing access to Office 365. A number of customers still do take into consideration the location of the user, where they're coming from, their physical location, whether they're required to be on or off the network. But more and more, we're thinking about the device they're accessing our system and service from, whether it's a trusted device that we manage or it's some other device that we're providing to the user. At the end of the day, we're thinking about different policies and procedures potentially for different applications, whether it's having one set of policies for people accessing email, another policy for accessing OneDrive, and maybe a different policy for a third-party application like Salesforce. At the end of the day, what we're really trying to protect, though, is the actual content and the data, right? At the end of the day, we're trying to protect the information that we're storing inside of SharePoint and OneDrive and other parts of Office 365. And we want to make sure we have good audit and visibility across all these different pillars. So I'm going to walk through just a couple of the scenarios that I typically think about with customers and some of the levers. And then I have a whiteboard example for you. I usually do this as a facilitated session with a customer in front of a big Surface Hub. And again, whiteboard there, it's a little bit different with the conference. So I actually have a screenshot of a whiteboard I did with the customer just to kind of show some of this in action. So the first thing when we're thinking about the user is certainly providing single sign-on, making sure they have one set of credentials to access Office 365 and related applications. In many cases, we want to provide multi-factor authentication. Certainly if the user's coming to us from off the network, or there's some sort of risk-based scenario they're coming at us with, where whether it's using a Tor browser to anonymize access or some sort of impossible or anomalous travel scenario where they're accessing us from different places that they haven't been coming from before. We really want to try to drive these security policies based off of groups, whether we're applying policies to the entire organization or specific groups of users. So we could have different policies for people that are based in the office versus others that travel, and maybe certain people like executives might be excluded from some of the policies that we want to apply. We also want to think about role-based access control and just-in-time and just-enough access, not only for our users, but also for our privileged accounts, whether they're global admins in Office 365, whether it's a SharePoint admin or a Teams admin. We really want to think about providing just-in-time and just-enough access and the ability to audit and log and report upon elevation. So folks that have been using Office 365 know that we operate the service with no standing access rights. So none of our admins have standing rights to any part of the service. And more of our customers, whether it's for their employees or for their business partners, want to have a similar model for their most privileged accounts. As I mentioned, many customers still think about doing things based on the location of the user. More and more, though, it's not necessarily are we physically on the network, are we requiring VPN? It might be based on the country they're coming from. We might identify certain trusted countries on non-trusted locations. Maybe there's no business reason why employees are trying to access the service from certain countries in the world, and maybe we want to restrict access from those countries. And a lot of times this comes down to things around conditional and limited access. How many of you are familiar with conditional access as a concept? Probably about half of you. So I'm going to spend, one of the scenarios I'm going to walk through is the idea around conditional access. Because not every time a user accesses the service should we apply the same set of policies and controls. If I'm in the office, on the network, on a trusted device, and you're challenging me with multi-factor, that's not a great user experience. But if I'm off the network, on a non-trusted device, on a non-trusted location, and maybe this is my first time at that location, maybe in those cases you want to conditionally challenge me. Or if I'm accessing secure content, maybe you challenge me in those scenarios. Certainly we have concepts around having a managed device, and whether that's a iOS device or an Android device, or a Windows or a Mac device. Is the user coming to us from a managed device or not? And is that device domain joined? Or more and more these days, is it Azure AD joined? Right, so thinking about different types of devices, whether it's a bring your own device or a choose your own device or a company provided device as well. As I mentioned, we may have different policies for certain apps, so different policies for accessing email, and maybe another set of policies that could apply to content, documents that are stored in SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams. And then different policies potentially around thick clients. Do we want to allow people to sync content to a non-managed device? Maybe, maybe not. Do I want to give them browser-only access potentially where they could view and edit in the browser, but maybe block them from downloading or syncing based on who they are and where they're coming from? As I mentioned, it's really about protecting the content. So certainly data loss prevention policies are key. We can look for over 100 different sensitive content types, look for credit card numbers, social security numbers, maybe different policies based on the type of content, as well as doing more and more around advanced threats. So not just looking for known viruses, but looking for zero-day attacks and anomalous behavior that might be happening by a malicious file. And having the ability to also label and protect the files and the content, whether it's a user defining the classification label or us identifying sensitive content and automatically labeling and classifying the content as well. That all gets to how do we get visibility, and there are a number of resources we've built into Office 365 to help with best practices and recommendations around security and compliance. How many of you have seen Secure Score before? Again, about half of you. So that's one of the things we'll talk about near the end is one of the best practices, because as the service continues to evolve, as we add new capabilities to the service, as you continue to make changes to the service, we want to continually run a set of best practices, tools, and recommendations to help you remain secure. We also have the Microsoft Security Graph, and it's not just the graph in the context of users as you think about things like search and the Microsoft Graph to drive great user experiences. It's using the security graph to correlate signals across all these different things that we see and the different signals we see across Office 365, from who the user is to where they're logging in from to the type of device they're accessing this from, and ultimately the content they're accessing as well. We've done a number of innovations around compliance, so there's a resource called the Compliance Manager as well that we'll talk about in a bit that looks around best practices and recommendations for mapping to control sets in things like ISO, NIST, as well as GDPR compliance. And we're doing more and more, as I mentioned, on correlating signals into what we call Microsoft Threat Intelligence to help us correlate all the different signals across the service that we see. Microsoft's also invested heavily in a cloud app security broker, which can help to identify and protect not only Office 365, but third-party applications. And more security professionals want to integrate the events into their SIEM, whether it's a third-party SIEM or Microsoft SIEM, which is known as Azure Sentinel, which again gives us visibility across not just the Microsoft apps and services, but other parts of the platform. So when I work with customers, I usually spend a full day with customers, sometimes 2 days, just around security and compliance. I'm going to, again, compress some of those conversations down. But it often starts off with a whiteboard exercise like this, where I'll go through and I'll start to draw those pillars out, and I'll start to understand where they are today. Are they using Microsoft solutions like ADFS for single sign-on? Are they using third-party applications for SSO? What things have they subscribed to from Microsoft, as well as third parties? So this is an example from a real customer engagement. The different colors we're designating to the customer whether they already owned that part of the Microsoft suite versus something they may need to purchase or not. But again, I spend a lot of time with customers trying to map this back to what is important and relevant to them. And again, I picked 4 of the most common scenarios to come back to me through these different whiteboard exercises. Now, another key concept before we get into the actual demonstration is the concept around Office 365 groups. What I find is that not all of my customers yet understand the critical importance of Office 365 groups, not only to SharePoint, but to other services across Office 365. One of the scenarios I'm going to cover is around groups and group management, things like expiration policies, attestation policies, as well as labeling those groups as well. And I'm bringing it up here because those groups and some of those settings actually are not managed in the Office 365 admin portal. Some of these settings require you to have rights to go into Azure Active Directory to manage some of the settings as well. So I often tell customers, and I explain to them, at Office 365 Groups, first off starts off as a membership service. As you think about how we're integrating things built on top of groups, it's more and more of these different microservices across Office 365. That includes storing content like files inside of a SharePoint site, right? So a modern SharePoint Teams site is connected to an Office 365 group by default. But we built other applications and services on top of that. When you're provisioning an Office 365 group, it has the ability to store notes in OneNote that are attached to that site that's part of the group. We also connect other services like Microsoft Planner for having the tasks and the plan associated to the group. Having a calendar provision for the group inside of Exchange. As I mentioned, a modern SharePoint site that's attached to that. As well as the ability to have a number of pre-built connectors that might be connecting to third-party applications, whether it's other services like Salesforce, whether it's connecting to services like Twitter. Again, these are all hung on top of the Office 365 group construct. Now what we've done is we've put multiple user experiences on top of groups. So certainly just using SharePoint and using a modern SharePoint team site, you can interact with the group. But folks may remember back a few years ago, Office 365 Groups first started off by being launched inside of Outlook, taking some of those distribution lists and converting them to, at the time, what we called Outlook Groups, which was the first conversation experience built on top of groups. A few years ago, we launched Microsoft Teams. And again, Teams is built on top of Office 365 Groups as well. And Yammer recently was given the option to start to use Azure Active Directory for the identity store. And once we do that, Yammer can start to have groups provisioned that store the content inside of Office 365 Groups as well. And that's really important as we think about security and compliance. It's important as we think about visibility from a user from search, whether it's coming through the SharePoint Home or through Delve, as well as those policies we're going to define for security, compliance, as well as things like auditing and e-discovery. So again, here's another example from a customer engagement of a picture I kind of drew. I blew it out a little bit on the bottom to help customers understand, when we're thinking about a team as an example, a team is built on top of a group. A group has a modern SharePoint team site, and every channel inside of Teams has its own folder inside of that default document library attached to the site, and then the files are stored inside of folders that are each mapped back to each of the individual channels. So again, wanted to give some kind of level setting quick on kind of the context around the logical architecture for these services. Make sense so far? All right. So these are the scenarios that I chose. So again, many different scenarios we can go through, but the four most common ones that I typically get asked about, first start off with just-in-time and just-enough access for these privileged accounts. I then start to think about conditional and limited access scenarios. How do we provision and manage groups, particularly around things like expiration policies and attestation for group membership? And then how do we get visibility in terms of best practices for security and compliance, but also visibility for suspicious events like mass download of content or other sort of alerts we want to become made aware of. So I'm going to walk through in the next half hour or so these four or so common scenarios. As I mentioned, I'm going to put the slides out tomorrow. I'm going to put out the resource links that are going to walk you through after how to configure a lot of these policies, as well as I have about 50 screenshots that I took as backup for this in case the internet goes down, because I was at that SharePoint conference at the Mandalay Bay a number of years back where the internet did go down. So ever since that, I've been really, really religious about having backups. But it's also a good resource I can give you to have screenshots of this if you don't have access to the session recording as well. So I'm going to start off, and I have really two different personas. The first persona I'm logged in here is Megan. And if you notice, first off, Megan does not have access to the admin center in Office 365. So what she needs to do first is she's been designated as a person that has the rights to elevate to a privileged role. So I'm going to go into Azure Active Directory Privileged Identity Management, and you'll see there are a number of different roles that Megan has been granted the ability to elevate to. So folks, I'm sure are familiar within Office 365, there are a number of different administrative permissions, global admin being the highest level of permission, and also role-based permission levels. So who can be an Exchange administrator versus a SharePoint administrator. There's actually, I think, 3 or 4 roles now specifically just to Microsoft Teams. And customers certainly can assign standing rights to be a global admin to the service. You could manage things on your own with things like PowerShell to build your own elevation process to elevate as well as rollback rights. But Microsoft's actually built a product called Privileged Identity Management, which can do just-in-time and just enough elevation of rights, not just for Office 365 administrative roles, but also Azure roles for things like access to Azure resource groups. So there's a person or people that play the role of the PIM administrator, and then the administrator of Privileged Identity Management can designate which roles people can elevate to, which people are allowed to elevate to that, and whether or not those people have automatic elevation when they request it, whether they have to go through some sort of additional approval, whether or not that person has to use multi-factor authentication before they can elevate. So I'm going to go through the scenario where Megan maybe has some reason to elevate to be a SharePoint admin. She's going to go in and start to activate her rights. Now, I did not enable multi-factor as a requirement for this, just because I like to turn my phone off before the demo. My phone is my multi-factor, so it's kind of a bad demo if I don't get the text message on the phone. So Megan's going to go ahead and she's going to request elevation without requiring multi-factor here. Now, you notice that she's been giving the ability to elevate, bless you. And you can see that if she does request elevation, by default, it's going to allow her to elevate for up to 6 hours. You can specify the elevation rights for up to 24 hours if you want to. She could also schedule the activation to happen sometime in the future. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start to activate and give a business reason that this is my SPC demo, and I'm going to begin the activation process. Now, again, you could require that the person get approval from maybe their manager or someone else. You could require them to maybe put a ticket number in to say it's related to this ticket that might be logged in your ticketing system, like ServiceNow as an example. But it's going to go through now and it's going to do basic checks in place to make sure that Megan is able to do this. And it's not going to go through and actually validate this, and it's going to go ahead and elevate her from being a standard user up to have the ability to be a SharePoint Online admin. So Megan's gone through and it's done that quick little 3-check process there. If I go back out and just look in PIM, you're going to notice her roles, and when I look at this, you're going to see that if we're still here tonight at 9:15, her rights are going to automatically roll back at 9:15 from being a privileged user back to a standard user. Now, she's getting notifications about this. The PIM administrators get notifications about it as well. And if I go over and take a peek over here, you notice the admin tile is not there. As I go ahead and hit refresh, the admin tile now lights up because now she has access to be a SharePoint Online admin. And then when she clicks into the admin tile, you'll see that the only admin center that should be available to her is the SharePoint Admin Center. It's not showing her Exchange and Teams because, again, she's only been granted access to Elevate as a SharePoint admin. Now, if I go over to the other persona, which is my persona who's logged in as a global admin and a PIM administrator, I can go in here and I can look at certainly the different roles that are out there in the policy that I've set up, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to look at the different roles that are there, and I'm going to drill into the audit history. And I can see, I'm just going to zoom down a little bit, but I can see in here the different elevation, the activations that have been done, and I can see Megan, again, right around 3:15, that she put her activation request in, she put her reason in, and I get an audit log about this as well. So again, the administrator can get notified via email about these elevation rights, but the administrator also has an audit log. So if there ever is a problem, or let's say Megan's leaving the organization, we can go in and we can look at all the times that she's been elevating and the reason why she was doing that, which might help us with doing forensics later on to look in the audit log for certain events because we know who's elevating, we know why they're elevating, and it gives us richer insight into why they might have been doing that as well. Another case I see for PIM is I work with customers that actually will apply this to their partners that might be provided access to the service. And we can identify cases where people are doing things outside of the tool. So I'll give you an example. I work with a customer that they had one of their business partners had a global admin rights in the service, and they initiated PIM, and PIM identified a case where the partner created a cloud identity, gave that cloud identity global admin rights as standing rights, totally disconnected from the customer's account provisioning and deprovisioning process. They got alerted of that and had a very frank and candid conversation with the partner of, well, why are you creating a cloud identity that we're not managing through our Azure AD Connect and our sync process? Who is this person? Why did you give them global admin rights? And why didn't you go through the established process? So it gave them additional visibility into cases where people might be working around the process. Now, for many of you, PIM might be an additional cost, but what I find is a lot of customers will license this just for their admin accounts. So 5, 10, 15 people that have admin rights, they'll license them just for that, just for the ability to have that no standing admin rights, and the ability to elevate, just in time and just enough, especially in regulated industries where they need to prove to their auditors on a regular basis that they have the right controls, not just with Microsoft as a SaaS provider, but also with their own admins, whether they're employees of the company or third parties that are managing the service on their behalf. So that's scenario one, privileged identity management around just-in-time and just enough elevation of rights. Scenario two is often focused around conditional or limited access. So the second scenario that often comes up is, let's say our persona here, Megan, is someone that travels quite a bit, and maybe she goes to conferences like the SharePoint conference as an example. And back in the day, if you went to some of our conferences, we had little kiosks set up. You might go to a library, you might go to a business partner's kiosk machine, you might go to your parents or your grandparents or your spouse's machine that might not be company managed. And one of those scenarios that often comes up is customers will often say, we're going to block access outright if you're not on a trusted device on a trusted network. But there may be some valid reasons why you may want to provide limited access to the service. So in this case, Megan happens to be logged in, and she's on a non-trusted network. She's at the SharePoint conference here. She's on a non-trusted device, which is the device I'm using, which is my Microsoft device, which is not managed by Contoso, the fictitious company she works for. In this case, rather than blocking Megan's access outright, she was given limited access to all of the SharePoint-based services. So OneDrive for Business, built on SharePoint. Microsoft Teams, because it's built on groups, stored content inside of SharePoint. And you'll notice that she's getting a banner here that's saying, based on your company's policies, you do not have the rights to have full access to the site. And you notice that the sync button doesn't show up. So if she were to try to sync this OneDrive library or sync a SharePoint site, whether it's a SharePoint site on its own or a site connected to a Microsoft team, she's restricted and limited in her ability to really do anything with the content. Now, if she clicks on the file, you'll notice that the download option is not there either. So she can't download a single file. And if she clicks on the open button, the only option she has is to open it in the online browser, the online client rather. So as you've heard, we have around 320 different file types and viewers, which enable you to have not only Microsoft Office applications available through the browser, but also other things like viewing CAD drawings and images and other document types directly through the browser as well. And if she goes in and clicks into the document and goes into Word Online, you're going to see again that same policy is not preventing her from editing the document. So if she still had edit rights, contributor rights on the document, she could still do her work, she could view, she could edit the document, but she still can't save the document. You notice that the Open in Word button that usually shows up in Word Online is not there either. The applications themselves are aware of this limited access policy and have trimmed the features away from her based on that. Now to contrast that, I'll show you my admin persona who is exempt from the policy. My persona is in the same tenant. My persona has the option to sync. My persona, if I click on this, gets the download option. And my persona could still open in Word and do a save as from there. So this is the idea of having limited access based on different groups in different policies for different people. Question? Yeah, please. Yeah, so the comment is, the observation, and this is true of any security capability, that there's nothing stopping them from taking a picture or a screenshot or anything else, right? But what we're trying to do is we're trying to move away from accidental to intentional, right? So if someone accidentally were downloading and syncing content, that's very different than someone intentionally taking a camera or a picture. And there's nothing that's foolproof, right? Even if I have a document that's rights protected and I've encrypted the document, I can still take my phone or a camera and take a picture of the screen. Now you're making it really, really difficult for me to do this because if it's a 50-page document, I've got to take 50 pictures, and I know, even as a standard user, that why are they making me go through all of these hoops? And if I have 50 documents and I have to do that 50 times for 50 documents, you're raising the barrier for people. So there's nothing that's 100% foolproof because, again, we all have cameras on our phones. So people have the ability to do those things. We're trying to minimize the risk by educating users on what the correct policy and procedure is for that. So to show you how this was set up, I'm going to go in now as a SharePoint admin, and I'm going to go into the modern SharePoint Online Admin Center, and I'm going to click into Access Control. And you'll notice that there's a policy here that allows me to say, what do I want to do in scenarios where a person is coming to us from an unmanaged device? Now, I certainly could block them outright. I could still give them full control, which is the default behavior. But I went ahead and clicked on the Allow Limited Web-Only Access. When I did this, SharePoint automatically created 2 conditional access policies for me inside of Azure Active Directory. So as I go back to Azure Active Directory and I go into the conditional access policies, you'll see that it created 2 policies for me. One that is governing what's happening when I'm coming at it from a managed application, such as Microsoft Word. Another is saying what's happening when I'm coming at it from a web browser. So I could have different policies for the thick clients, like Office, compared to the browser-based clients. I'm going to click into the browser-based restriction. I'm not going to go through all of the policy settings, but just to kind of give you a feeling for kind of what you can do and what I did here. So the first thing that I did, and this is a very common kind of best practice, is I did not want to have the same policy apply to all the personas. There are some people, like my admin persona, that I did not want to have governed by the policy. So one of the first things that I did is I created a group. In this case, I created a group where I'm assigning members explicitly. One of the things, if you have good hygiene on your attributes in Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, is to build dynamic groups. So I help to manage a platform for all 50 Microsoft Technology Centers worldwide. Every time we bring online a new technology center, we have standard demo personas that get provisioned. So every MTC has a person that's a product manager or a salesperson. We have standard titles defined for them inside of Active Directory. And then we're using the dynamic groups capability to dynamically add people or remove them from the appropriate groups. We then use those groups to do group-based license assignment to assign them the right Office 365 license, which gives them not only E1 or E3, but it enables or disables different services instead of having to use PowerShell to assign or remove the right applications. But we can then use those same groups to apply a policy to say anyone in this group has the policy applied, or we could exclude certain people. So what I did here is I said this policy only applies to people that have been put into the limited access group. You notice that I could also do this based on guest users. So I could have different policies if I'm inviting a guest person from outside of the organization, and I could have a different set of conditional access policies for guests, which might be federated business partners or others outside of our organization. I then went ahead and scoped the policy to say apply it to SharePoint. And again, we all know, I think most of us in this room, that OneDrive for Business is built on top of SharePoint. Microsoft Teams is built on top of SharePoint. So the policy is warning me here that if you apply this policy to SharePoint, other applications that rely on SharePoint for content services will also be affected by the policy. I'm then looking at the conditions that I want to apply this under. And there's different things we could look at, again, based on things like a risky sign-on. Is it a person coming from an impossible travel scenario where they logged in Boston and they logged in San Francisco and then they logged in China within 5 minutes? That, unless they're remoting in, is an impossible travel scenario. Or in this case, is it someone that is using a certain application? In this case, I'm saying if the person is coming and they're in the group and they're accessing SharePoint and they're using a web browser, then I could do things like, say, grant them access, but maybe require them to use multi-factor authentication or require them to be on a compliant device or not. What I did here is I just basically said leverage app enforced policy restrictions. So this little checkbox tells Azure Active Directory that after I go through the different checks to say, who is the user? Are they part of the group? Are they using an application that's being checked and managed? Hand that back to SharePoint to say, hey, they passed our checks. You go ahead and enforce the rest of the policy. That's how SharePoint and OneDrive then know to trim the features like the sync button, or to disable the ability to download, or disable the ability to open in Word. It's basically just setting that one flag. SharePoint and OneDrive and other apps understand to honor that restriction based on the app enforced policy restriction. So that's scenario 2 around conditional and limited access. And again, there are many more knobs and switches you can do with conditional access and limited access. And this idea around conditional access doesn't just apply to SharePoint. It applies to other Office 365 applications, as well as any other third-party application you might be setting up with single sign-on and security management. Again, whether it's things like Box or Dropbox or Salesforce and other applications that you might be using Azure AD to govern the access to. So the third scenario that I wanted to cover is around groups and group management. So we talked earlier about how Microsoft Teams is built on top of Office 365 groups. So if I go back over to my standard persona, Megan, you'll notice that she has a team that, again, very creative, called Megan's Team. Megan's Team, you might notice, is provisioned as being private. Megan's Team has also been classified as being sensitive. So today, the way you define the sensitivity labels or the classification labels for groups is via PowerShell. Everyone was in the keynote this morning. I think Navjot did the demo this morning around how pretty soon we're going to have the ability in the Security Compliance Center to apply Microsoft Information Protection labels, not just to documents, but also to SharePoint groups and SharePoint sites that are built on top of groups as well. So I'll give you the PowerShell script that I used to provision it. But basically, I just went ahead and said, for my tenant, these are the classification labels that we make available to a user. And whenever they create a brand new group, whether it's because they're creating a Microsoft team, or they're creating a modern SharePoint team site, or a Yammer group that's connected, this is going to be the default classification label for this. So this is how that general label or the private label showed up inside of her team, was based on me defining the classification label through PowerShell. And then when she provisioned the new team, it defaulted to the general level, and it gave her the option to override that. Now, the other thing you might notice is that when she hovers over her team, she's being told that based on the IT policy, this team is going to expire on June 14th. And if she further clicks into the team and looks at the menu, first off, she has the option to renew the team. She also has the ability, as she manages the team, to look at the settings that might be applying to this. And you can see she has a policy around team expiration. The way this is done is, again, inside of Azure Active Directory, we can define group-based expiration policies that apply to modern SharePoint team sites, as well as Microsoft Teams. Folks probably know that Office 365 Groups by default is set up that anyone in the organization can provision a group. And again, that's important because things like modern SharePoint team sites, Microsoft Teams, Yammer, Planner, et cetera, are built on top of groups. And if we turn off the ability for people to self-provision a group, we stop them from being able to provision these other services. There is an option, as I mentioned, to have it wide open, to have it off completely. There's also an option in between where we can say certain people that maybe go through some level of training, maybe they watch a video, they fill in a Microsoft form, that form has a little quiz that grades them, and then if they pass the quiz, we use a Microsoft flow to add them to the appropriate group to maybe allow them to provision it. But one of the reasons why organizations typically want to have a tight set of policies and controls around who can create groups is they're afraid of sprawl. People creating something and then abandoning it, and we have all these sites and teams that later on are out there and no one knows if they're needed any longer. The other concern around it is often around who's going to attest to the membership. So if we delegate the ability for people to create groups and manage the membership, maybe we have a requirement that on a regular basis we have to audit and do some sort of attestation that the members still have the appropriate access. So if you look at Megan's email, you'll notice that she actually has 2 emails sitting in her inbox. Email number 1 was warning her or advising her that on June 14th, her team is going to expire. And if she clicks the renew, it would go ahead and automatically extend the team. She also has a second email sitting here, and this is requiring Megan to do an access review. So we have the ability now to do access reviews around not just is a group needed, but also are the members of the group appropriate. And if she clicks into the start review here, you'll see that we actually have a number of recommendations that we're making for her to help her determine if the people that are in the group should still be members. So you notice that currently Megan's team has 3 other members, or 2 other members, one including herself. And we're getting a little tip that says that based on our understanding of the service, based on their access to the team, we recommend that you approve them and extend their access to it. And the reason why is because this person has actually accessed the team within the last 30 days. Now, we can have attestation policies that apply not just for people within the organization, we can also have different policies for guest members. So as an example, let's say I'm working on a project with my friend Sue. I invite Sue into our team, and Sue comes in. Now, Sue may stay with the organization, so the company doesn't terminate her identity because she continues to be employed by our business partner, but maybe we stop working on the project together. And I know that Sue's not working on the project because I own the group, and I know that, hey, that project completed. Sue's working on other projects within the company now. I don't want to have her have access to this because maybe there's some sensitive content we're storing within there. This gives me that reminder to say, hey, you know what? Just because Sue's login is still valid and because Sue's business relationship with our company is still valid, maybe we should remove her from this group because she no longer has a business need to be part of this team because she's no longer working on that specific project any longer. So it's giving her that reminder. If I go back into Azure Active Directory, I'll show you how this is set up and managed. So again, back in Azure AD, I'm going to ignore that, I'm not saving that. And if I go into groups, you'll notice that I have the ability to go in and look at, first off, the expiration policies. So the way that I created that policy that sent the email to Megan is I created an expiration policy that is running every 31 days. It has to be at least 30 days. And it's saying that any of the groups, now I could apply it to the entire company. I chose to scope it to just Megan's groups. Any of the groups that have been out there for 31 days or more require some level of regular validation that it still is needed. Now, if there are no owners of the group, let's say there was only one owner or there were two owners and they both left the group or they left the company, we can notify an account or distribution list that there are these orphan groups that are out there. Or we can go ahead and, in this case, again, scope them just to Megan's group. So Microsoft does this quite a bit inside of our organization. We have processes that run, I think every 6 months is the way we set it up in Microsoft, that any groups that I own, whether, again, it's a modern SharePoint Teams site or a Microsoft team, I am required as a group owner to go in and validate and certify that I still need that collaboration space. So? Yeah, so the group expiration policy that's here, I believe, is Azure Active Directory Plan 1, which is either on its own or part of EMS-E3. The attestation policy, I believe, is Azure Active Directory Plan 2 or EMS-E5. So those are things that are not part of Office 365 proper, but they're part of Microsoft 365, which Office 365 is now part of. Courtney? Yeah, it's a good question. So the question is, do I have the ability to exclude groups? So maybe I want a policy that says apply this to all groups except for maybe these 5. Today we don't do that, but I know that's something we've heard before. The other thing that we've heard is that what if I know the group is actively being used? So it's one thing to require the group owner to go in and validate and approve it. And if the owner does not do that, we're going to notify them in 3 times. We're going to tell them 30 days out, 15 days out, and then 1 day out. But what happens if they ignore it? Or they're on vacation, they're out of the office on parental leave or what have you for an extended period of time. If the group gets deleted, it will sit in the recycle bin for 30 days, and then we'll permanently delete it. So one of the things that we're thinking about is, well, what if we know the group is actively being used? If we know there's active usage of the group, whether it's people contributing content or viewing content, give the option to auto-extend it as well, without requiring a person to go in and validate that as well. Now, the access reviews are a little bit different. So the way I define the access review policy is, again, under groups, I again picked on my friend Megan here, and I created an access review policy. That this access review policy for Megan, and again, I can see that there are 3. I can see that this review is in process. I could stop the review if I wanted to. When I created it, I defined that she had a month to do it. So I kicked off the process on May 15th. I gave her until June 14th to go ahead and do the review. I can see, though, who are the reviewers that are targeted. So what I did here is I scoped it to the owners of the group, so people that own the team. In this case, it's Megan. I could send them a reminder if I wanted to. And then I can go in and look at the settings, and I can see, do I want to send them an email notification? Do I want to send them reminders? Do I require the reviewer to give a reason for the approval or not? Again, what's the schedule and the start and end date? But also what happens when it's done. So I mentioned before that we can have recommendations. So you saw that our recommendation in this case was that she extend the 3 people to automatically be extended for their rights. But I have the option to go ahead and say, if the owner does not respond after the period of time, do we accept the recommendations that we've provided? Do we automatically approve their access and renew them for another period of time? Do we automatically remove their access, or do we leave things alone? So you have some flexibility and options as far as this. Now, these access review policies can also be applied to specific groups. So you could have different policies for different groups. I happen to apply the same policy to both of Megan's groups, but this one does, Courtney, give you a little bit more flexibility than the expiration policy, that we can say these groups, because maybe they're related to sensitive content for a financial services organization, they have one set of policies, but other things that are more general around collaboration and talking about what's on the menu in the cafeteria, or something that may not be as business critical, maybe has a different set of policies around access reviews as well. So that was scenario 3. We talked about kind of groups and group management. We looked at the labeling of the group, and then we also talked about the access reviews as well as the expiration policies. The 4th scenario is, how do we think about auditing and visibility of all these different events that are happening and all the different changes across the service? So folks might be familiar with the idea that recently we introduced dedicated admin portals for security and for compliance. So we've had in Office 365 a security and compliance portal for a while. Some of the feedback we've gotten is that for some organizations that's great. There are people that their role is security and compliance. In many large organizations, especially in regulated industries, there might be some separation of duty. There might be a team that owns security that is different from the team that owns compliance. So we've started to build dedicated and role-based portals that honor not just the role-based access controls, but also are more task-focused based on those personas. So I'm going to start off with the Security Center. So this is the new Microsoft 365 Security Center. So I mentioned earlier, we went through a bit of a change. You probably saw some of this in the keynote. I think Seth's title actually said, General Manager of Microsoft 365. So a while back, we changed some of the way that we refer to the product set. So at the top level, there's Microsoft 365, which is a licensing vehicle, but it's also how a lot of our engineering and product management teams are now organized. It's comprised of 3 main pillars. Office 365 is one part of that, and as people know, Office 365 has services like Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams and Stream and other things. It then comprises our security capabilities called Enterprise Mobility and Security, things like Azure Active Directory, Intune for device management, information protection, which again protect not just Office 365, but can protect third-party applications. And then there's Windows 10, the Windows client. So Office 365, Enterprise Mobility and Security, and Windows Client are all part of Microsoft 365. And we made changes to allow you to license things as a suite if you wanted to. But we've also started to change the administrative portals to say, if you do use all of these services, wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to go from the Office 365 Admin Center into the Intune portal or into the Azure AD portal? Wouldn't it be great if those things were all integrated? So you're seeing more and more of those insights correlated and integrated into the Microsoft 365 Security Center. So one of the first things that you'll see in here is, again, it's giving me visibility around certain identities or users that might be at risk. It's also giving me targeted specific recommendations around Secure Score. So Secure Score is a tool that we've had out there for a couple of years now, and Secure Score acts as a best practices recommendation engine. So folks that might have been used to using, again, Exchange and SharePoint on premises, historically might have brought in Microsoft Premier Support. And they come in, they do a readiness review, they do a wrap, right? They come in and they run some tools and they give you some reports, and then you go back and you implement the recommendations, and then maybe a year later, they come in and they run the tool again to give you some best practices recommendations. We took that same sort of concept and applied it into Office 365, but rather than requiring you to go ahead and hire someone to do it, and rather than requiring someone to run the script, we actually do this in real time for you in Office 365, and we make targeted recommendations. So we can start to see that there are a number of things that they're recommending in our demo environment. I can also look over time at my history. So what are the changes that I've been making, and then what has the result been as far as my Secure Score? So I almost think about this as a credit score, right? Folks that are familiar with credit scores, I know in the United States and other countries, lenders will use that as a way of determining the risk before they'll go ahead and maybe grant you a line of credit, a mortgage or a credit card or an automobile loan or something like that. Same sort of concept where we can go in and say, these are the risks that are out there, and these are the maximum amount of points you can get based on your implementation of our recommendations. The top recommendations typically in Secure Score, from my experience, is number 1, limit the number of global admins that you have. Number 2, make sure your global admins are using multi-factor authentication. Number 3, make sure your users at least conditionally have multi-factor as well. Because typically the number one security threat for organizations is identities being compromised. And it typically happens from a whale phishing campaign or a spear phishing campaign where people are being compromised. In those accounts, as a standard user, may or may not have multi-factor enabled. So if the bad person gets their credentials, we may not be challenging them with multi-factor. And it's even worse if it's an admin account. And it's even really bad if that admin account has standing admin rights, that now someone can compromise an admin account. That admin account has global admin rights, and then that admin account can do things like maybe create a mail forwarding rule to forward all of our mail outside the organization, or do an e-discovery search across all mailboxes in the organization to look for sensitive content, like people emailing user IDs and passwords to different services that might not have single sign-on, as an example. So Secure Score typically recommends those as some of the best practices. Now, those aren't the only thing, and if you actually drill in and look at the recommendations, you'll start to see these are the number of accounts that don't use multi-factor. These are the risks that you're at risk for. This is the impact of making the change from a user perspective. So back to the beginning when I talked about balancing security and usability. This is low impact to a user because typically standard users are not global admins. So the risk of change to a typical end user is low, and the complexity to implement is low as well. And then it walks you through and it says, well, if you're mapping back to specific controls in specific industries, like ISO 27018, like NIST 800-171, these are the controls that this is mapping back to. So if your company, either internally or with an independent third party, is doing some sort of audit, it's great that Microsoft is certified on over 1,100 different controls that map back to these. How do you go ahead and look at for your admins, your user accounts, that you're doing what's recommended as well? And now you could say, Microsoft, this is great, you recommended it. We have a third party in place that you're not having visibility into. And you can give us that feedback and say, you know what, this is great, Microsoft, I have a third party. Let us know what that is, and basically we'll clear that recommendation for you. Now, we did something very similar, though, with compliance. So we built a compliance portal that is here. Within the compliance portal, we built a compliance score as well and a compliance manager. So if I want to drill into the compliance manager, similar idea, I can pop out to the compliance manager. And when I go in here, it'll have me just sign in. And you'll see there are a number of different policy templates that we've put out there for, things like GDPR compliance, NIST 800-171. Again, this applies not just to Office 365, but to other Microsoft Cloud services like Azure. And if I drill into NIST as an example, it will tell you and give you a recommendation of what your compliance score might be. It lets you know what Microsoft services are in scope for this. Where is Microsoft at for its part of the shared responsibility model? And as you'd expect, we've met our part of the bargain. And then if I look at the customer controls, it goes in and says, okay, for the customer, these are the things that we recommend you go through and review and assess. We've assigned a score. We've, again, mapped it back to industry standard controls. You can assign something to someone to review. They can go ahead and reflect a status. They can attach documentation that supports this. And as these regulations and these certifications continue to evolve, we're constantly running this against the environment to, again, give you specific targeted recommendations for some of the certifications that your company is concerned about based on your industry. So the third part of this is then looking at auditing and visibility, right? So we first looked at what are Microsoft's recommendations for our company for security and compliance. How do I get some additional visibility into what people are doing in my environment? So for this, I'm going to go back to the traditional Security and Compliance Center, and I can go over and do a search. And maybe we know that one of our colleagues, Diego, is leaving the organization, and we found out that Diego is going to a competitor. So if your company is like mine, someone comes in, they give their notice, they say, we're going to our top competitor. We say, thank you for your time. Give us your corporate laptop, give us your devices, we walk you out the door. Most employees are aware of that. So what I really want to do is, because we've already terminated Diego's account, I want to get some forensics into what was Diego doing before he gave us his notice, because Diego's been around a while and he knows that's our policy, and maybe Diego was doing something that he shouldn't be doing with our content. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to search on Diego, and I'm going to spell his name right, and I'm going to go ahead and execute a search. And I'm going to query across the Office 365 audit logs for all of the activities that Diego's been doing over the last week or so. So let's just take a second to kind of query and come back with it. And you can see that Diego, he logged in, he uploaded some files, so that's nothing really bad. He broke sharing, he shared some files with some people. That's good. I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna try not to click into the screen. But I start to notice here that Diego has actually started to download a bunch of files. So Diego has been downloading a bunch of files to his device. So it might be a normal behavior, or it might be a case where Diego's getting ready to leave the organization. He's taking things like some of our customer information, some of our upcoming budgets and proposals that are out there. So I can query the audit logs, but I can also go ahead and create different alerts. So you'll notice here that as I go in and look at my alerts, Office 365 has the ability to determine not just these mass share events, but I've identified, if I keep going down here, that Diego, I got flagged with a high alert that Diego triggered a mass download policy. This is done via integration with our Cloud App Security Broker. So Microsoft has a Cloud Application Security Broker, which extends the built-in Office 365 security and compliance capabilities and can protect not just Office 365, but again, other third-party applications. Salesforce, ServiceNow, Box, Dropbox, Google Drive. It can go in and determine not just these events like the mass download, it also can determine things like data loss prevention. So we've identified PCI information, so credit card information might be shared out there as well. So as I click into the mass download event, I can actually go over and drill directly into Microsoft Cloud App Security to get additional visibility into what Diego was doing and where he was coming from. Now, if I was alerted to this before Diego gave his notice, because he did this about a week before he told us he was leaving, I would have been triggered and alerted that Diego's taking this content, and I can go in and maybe do things like review it and resolve it, or I can go ahead and look at Diego's account, and I can start to look at what else is he doing. Maybe Diego wasn't just downloading the file. Maybe Diego started sharing the file with his consumer Gmail account. Maybe Diego shared it with other people. What else was Diego doing across Office 365? Maybe I can give him the benefit of the doubt and maybe terminate his sessions and make him log in again. Maybe I could suspend his login until we can have a conversation. I can maybe start to pivot around the content that Diego's been working with. So I can start to look at, well, what other activity was happening? Was it just Diego that was downloading files? Were there other people across the organization doing something similar, which might represent a larger risk than one person? Maybe other accounts have been compromised. Let's assume we didn't know Diego was leaving, and maybe other accounts have been compromised. Maybe we can start to look for different regions of the world. So again, the Microsoft Cloud App Security Broker has a number of different standard policies and templates that can look for not just things like mass download by a single user, but in this case, it identified that my demo persona was doing a massive amount of sharing. So it was actually a script that I wrote that created a site and then started sharing all of the files within the site to all these different people, which again might be some sort of an event that I may want to look at. I mentioned things like PCI compliance for data loss prevention, as well as noticing things like this person is logging in from a country or somewhere they don't normally log in from. Again, maybe that's some sort of suspicious behavior because this is not normal, not just for our company, but for this specific individual. And oh, by the way, this individual is also an admin account. And because it's an admin account, maybe we should have a higher level of risk and concern because it's a user logging in from a non-trusted location that they haven't visited before. And oh, by the way, they have standing admin rights and they could be doing things that might be privileged. Give us some additional insight into that as well. So I know we have about 10 minutes left here, but those are kind of the four most common scenarios. Now, there are others that I go through with customers, but those are four of the most common things. So we started off with looking at just-in-time and just-enough elevation around privileged accounts. We then looked at limited access scenarios and how we scoped that to OneDrive for Business and how we could apply that conditionally to different groups of users. We looked at expiration, attestation, and labeling classification policies for things built on Office 365 groups, like modern sites. And then we looked at visibility around Microsoft recommendations for things like Secure Score, Compliance Manager, as well as auditing and alerting. So as we move into the wrap-up, again, a couple of recommendations that I'd strongly encourage you to consider. First off, review Secure Score. It is built into all Office 365 license plans, so you have the ability to go in and look at Secure Score and Compliance Manager to get recommendations for your environment that are tailored to your company. They will give you benchmarks against industry regulations, so specific certifications that are out there. It also can benchmark you against companies of a similar size to you, as well as a similar industry. So having a benchmark to know how do we relate to other people that are in our industry that are a similar size is very helpful when you're thinking about staffing as well as any sort of investment you might want to be making. Number 2 is protecting privileged accounts. Number 1 way, first off, is not having a ton of global admins and making sure you're reviewing regularly who has those admin rights, making sure those admin accounts are protected with multi-factor authentication. And if you have the ability or desire, consider just-in-time and just-enough access. So maybe don't have standing admin rights. Whether you do it through our tool, Privileged Identity Management, or you do it through some sort of process, whether it's a PowerShell script or an application you use to elevate people, but also handle the rollback of their rights after the window of time. And then lastly, consider things like conditional and limited access. Again, don't always make things so difficult for the user that they have to do multi-factor and jump through all these hoops to get access to the service. But if they're coming at your service and they're a trusted user from a non-trusted device on a non-trusted location, maybe you want to consider challenging them with things like multi-factor or doing some additional logging and alerting to monitor what sort of activity is happening in those scenarios. So with 5 minutes left, I really, again, want to thank you all for, again, coming to the conference this week and spending some time at this session. As I mentioned, I'm going to be posting, probably tomorrow, all of the slides that are here, the screenshots. I'm going to create a blog post that's going to have access to direct links to all the capabilities that I showed you. I'm going to provide you the PowerShell script if you want to do the labeling of the group while you're waiting for the new capabilities to come out, to have that built into the portal itself. I am also very active on Twitter, so if you want to, if you're on Twitter as well, feel free to follow me on Twitter. I tend to share information related to not just SharePoint and OneDrive, but all of Office 365, as well as our security and compliance capabilities as I learn about it. So with that, I'll hang up here for another 5 minutes or so. I'll take some questions before the next speaker comes in at 4. But again, really want to thank you for your time this afternoon and appreciate you coming to the conference.